Welcome everyone to the sort of last lecture of Introduction to Deep Learning. So we're really excited to have Antonio Torralba today as a guest lecturer for this year. So Antonio is the head of the AI plus D faculty, a professor of electrical engineering and computer science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. And he received his degree in telecommunications engineering from Telecom Barcelona, which is actually the place where I also got my degree, and a PhD degree in Grenoble. And after that, he spent some postdoctoral training at the Brain and Cognitive Science Department and the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab, also at MIT, where he's now a professor. He received numerous prizes, NSF, teaching prizes. I think it would take quite a long time to name them all. And today he's here with us to talk about an exciting topic, dissecting neural networks. So I think everyone, even people who started this semester in deep learning, will benefit from this talk. So really looking forward to hearing what Antonio has to say.
Okay, thank you, Laura, for the introduction. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about dissecting neural networks, and I have a lot of slides, so we'll see where we get in 1 hour. So my guess is that there will be no questions. I don't know, Laura, if there is any questions during the talk or anything. But...
I mean, for the people on Zoom, they can ask questions whenever you allow them, and I will be monitoring the YouTube for questions on the chat.
Okay, so anytime that there are any questions, just interrupt me, because otherwise I can just fill the as many hours as you give me. So okay, so first, this is the work of a lot of people, and here there are some of them, but most of the work I will be presenting is mostly the PhD of David Bao, who is a PhD student in my group and is finishing now, and it's just amazing. So. Okay, so if this is the last lecture of a deep learning class, then probably you have already seen a lot of drawings that look like this, with a lot of units, and neural networks are really amazing and doing things that look quite complicated a few years ago. And in my group, we have been working for a long time on the problem of recognizing places. So given a picture like this one, being able to tell that this picture has been taken at an hotel room, or a picture of an office or a corridor or a kitchen and so on. So this was a problem that it was quite hard at the time, but with deep learning it just became really, really powerful. And these are just some examples of pictures taken with the phone, and then the output of the classifier trained to recognize different types of scenes. And so here what it says categories, it tells you the class that is assigned to this picture, and there are this is out of 300 different possibilities, so it's a complicated task, and the confidence that it has, so very similar to ImageNet challenge. But these are pictures that are not nicely framed, these are just arbitrary views, and it's just the system was really good at recognizing these things. And of course, these neural networks look like black boxes, and there is a big important line of work in the community trying to open up that black box and understand how it's working, and that's what is called explainable AI. And there are a lot of groups working on trying to build models, systems that allow you to peek inside the network to understand what is happening. So, there is this important question about why do they work? And by why do they work, I don't mean all the theoretical proof of why do they converge to a solution that actually has good performance. I just mean something more mundane, like what is the representation that they learn? What is the structure of that representation so that they actually can solve this task? So this why do they work is not so much on the mathematical sense, but more on the human explainable sense, in which I just want to understand, why what they do internally makes sense in order for this network to actually solve the task. So, this is an example of a picture taken, this is in 2013, 14, where the system is just trying to recognize places. And this is a picture that I took in an hotel room before giving a talk. And, it says hotel room. And it also says bedroom, but most likely an hotel room. And then I took this picture, and it also say hotel room. And this was really intriguing, because this is really not a nice picture. Even the bed is not visible. The only thing that is visible here is this lamp. That when you look at this lamp, it really doesn't look like the lamp that one has at home. So maybe that's what tells you this is an hotel room. So I thought, okay, maybe the system is actually learning to detect objects. Even though we are not training the system to detect objects, maybe internally it learns to detect these objects, and it recognizes this is a lamp, and this lamp as a particular type of lamp that belongs to hotel rooms. So that's how we started working on the problem of dissecting neural networks, to understand what was the representation, and if we could make sense of the representation, such as discovering that it's learning to detect lamps. And sometimes they fail. Like, for instance, you train a network to recognize actions, and in this particular image, the output is washing dishes. So sometimes they work amazingly well, and sometimes they just fail. And you want to know why, Okay, it looks like there is a sink, there is a person, but why washing dishes? So you want to understand what is going on inside the network to understand both the successes and the failures. Another issue with neural networks, and probably you have seen this, is that they require a lot of data for them to learn anything. So you need to train them with a lot of data. And despite that, now there are also a lot of recent works showing that you can learn networks in an unsupervised way. Still, when you have a lot of data, it is unbeatable. That's the best you can do. And that requires, it's a lot of effort just to create those data sets that are going to be used to train these neural networks. And here is an example of an image that has been segmented so that you can use it to train semantic segmentation with neural networks. And you need to label a lot of images like that, and it's just a lot of effort. And that's very different from how humans learn. Humans do not learn through a lot of annotated examples. They just go into the world, play with the world, and they learn. And they discover categories, they understand materials, they segment objects, they do motion, 3D, all of that, without even before saying any word. So there is a lot of learning that happens in a fairly unsupervised way. So you have this problem with neural networks about how do they work, what do they fail, and they need so much data. How do we get rid of all that data? There is another class of neural networks that's even more intriguing. Those are GANs, which probably you have also seen in class. GANs are these amazing neural networks that look like classifiers, but upside down, or left, right, or reversed, where the input now is the output, and the output is an image instead of being a class. So in a generative adversarial neural network, you take as input a random vector, let's say of 512 dimensions of random number sample from an independent Gaussian distribution. And then those numbers go through a set of layers that will process these numbers by recombining them, applying a simple nonlinearity, upsampling, and then step by step until you have a very long dimensional vector that you can rearrange into a picture. And it just looks like an image. And it's just quite amazing. And then you sample a different random vector, and you get a different random image, another random vector, another image, and so on. So the question is, okay, this is even more magical than a classifier. How do they work? And GANs have evolved really, really fast. Like in 2014, this was the best generative model available. This is when this idea was introduced. Of this particular way of training generative models. Generative models have been existing for a long time, but this particular way of training it on an adversarial setting was introduced in 2014. And these were the images that were produced, which actually in 2014 looked pretty amazing because they do look like images. You cannot recognize anything here, but there is a sky, there is some grass. It's just quite amazing that they got even some pixels right. And just 2 years later, these were the type of images that were generated, which was just quite impressive at the time. This was a generative model trained to reproduce bedrooms. And there seems to be some perspective. There are some windows and some things on the walls. There seem to be walls. There are recognizable walls and recognizable floors. So it's pretty amazing. And just 2 years later, this was the type of images that were generated by GANs. It's just quite amazing how in a span of 4 years, this thing has evolved from basically not doing anything to doing images that look pretty realistic. That you can see artifacts, but this is quite amazing already. And just an example of how far GANs have gone. This is a project that we had just presented a few months ago, where here is, you all know the game of Pac-Man, and here is an example of a sequence from Pac-Man, but this sequence is not generated by the game itself. This is a GAN that has learned to reproduce the game. And it's not just learning to reproduce the images of the game, it's actually reproducing the whole thing, the controls also. You can actually play with this GAN and play the Pac-Man game. And so that was presented in this paper that is a collaboration with Sania Fittler, also in Toronto, and NVIDIA, and a number of just great students and researchers working on this project. So the system really, what it does, it looks at the real game where someone is playing the game. In this case, the game is being played by just an RL agent so that we can make automatic sequence generation. And then we have a system that watches all the controls that the system is using and the reaction that they produce on the video itself. And then we learn to reproduce a system that we call game GAN that takes as input the same controls and it will output the same sequence or a different sequence. So you will have to learn to randomize the sequence so that you can actually play the game. And the nice thing is that this system now is like a copy of the game, but it's like a platform independent. No? Whenever you can play the GAN, you can put the GAN, you can play the game. Of course, it's not exactly like the game. It has all these different artifacts that GANs introduce in the world, but that makes just the whole thing even more interesting. No? You can see the Pac-Man is not completely perfectly drawn, but and the ghosts, sometimes they miss the eyes and so on. But it just looks really cool, and you can play it. So it's a playable game, and sometimes you see some things appearing and disappearing. But it has learned that when you eat these things, the ghosts have to turn blue and so on. So it's just a really interesting thing. So the question now was, okay, these GANs just work amazingly well. So what is happening here? How do they work? And this is just another neural network, and we also want to be able to explain it. So all the techniques that we use in explainable AI to understand how classifiers work, we should be able to use them also to explain how GANs work. And so here is one thing, is that when you train these GANs, so you start always with a lot of images. No? So let's see. So here is a set of images that have churches and castles and so on. And we just want to train a GAN that will learn to look at these images and reproduce images that seem as being a sample from this data set. So the way that you do that is you train the GAN, and once you have it, you sample from it. And these are examples of images that are returned by the GAN once you sample from it. And the question then is, okay, these images look really amazing, but even more interestingly is that if the GAN is able to render images that look so nice, what has it learned? It apparently has learned a lot of things about the visual world, and it must have discovered also localized properties of these images. Does it know about objects? Does it know what a tree is? So we wanted to know what has the GAN learned. And in particular, when we started working on this, David looked at this set, and there was one set of images that caught his attention. And one of them is this one here. So if you look at this image, and I will just make it slightly bigger, this is a sample from the GAN, and you can see that it has a watermark. It's not just a watermark, it also has a subtitle. And this is because on the training set, there were some images that contain watermarks, and the GAN has learned to put watermarks. It's hard to read what the watermark is, it's making it up, but it does look like a watermark. And the subtitle also, no? The title is hard to read, but there is clearly a subtitle. And the question then was, well, this is actually not happening only once. It happens many times. There are a number of images that have this property. So the question is, are there watermark units here? Just like in neuroscience, there is this hypothesis that in your brain you have a neuron that fires when you see your grandmother, which is called the grandmother cell. Are there watermark neurons in this network where you have a unit that whenever an image gets produced that there is a watermark on it is because there is a particular unit that was active. And if that unit was inactive, then the watermark wouldn't have been there. And this is just an hypothesis. Is there something very localized in this network that is responsible for drawing these watermarks? Or is it just a distributed process and the entire network is responsible of deciding that the watermark will appear or not? So just to remind you, each unit here is really it takes as input the outputs of many layers of all the units from the previous layer by applying convolutions and then a nonlinearity. So each unit really is it has a special map of activations. So you can plot things like this, where in one particular unit, you are going to have a particular spatial resolution that then it will get upsample as you go further into different layers before it goes into generate the image. And here I'm just showing just one visualization. This doesn't correspond to this image, but it's just to show what I mean, where each pixel here represents the activation of this unit in that particular location of the image, which will correspond to one big patch here. It's not just that patch, it really has a much wider effect because it depends on how wide your receptive field is when propagated towards the output, but more or less it will correspond to something around this region. Then the brighter signal here represents that this unit is strongly activated in that location. So probably you have seen something about activations of units. So this is just an activation map, a heat map for that particular unit. And you can do the same thing for all of the units. So David went into the network and looked unit by unit to see if there was a unit that seemed to correlate with the presence or absence of watermarks. And after looking at many units, then he found that in layer 4 on big GAN, in a 14-layer GAN network, layer 4, unit 201, whenever it got activated, a watermark appeared. And in particular, these are the 5 images that were generated when the GAN, when that unit was the most strongly activated. And then now you can also look at the heat map of that unit and check which part of the image was the part of the image for which this unit was strongly activated, and that happened to be the bottom. So whenever this unit was activated very strongly on the bottom, a subtitle appeared. And it's not the only one. Unit 445 also had the same effect. These are the 5 images when generated when that unit was the most strongly activated. And this is the region where that unit was strongly activated. So it also corresponds to the subtitle. And there were 5 more units that had this property. So what happens now if you turn them off? So you don't do anything, you don't retrain the network, you don't touch anything else. The only thing I'm going to do is you take layer 4, where those 7 units appear, and just set them to 0 all the time. Don't let them activate ever. And then just randomly sample, let all the other activations follow their normal behavior, and just turn off those units that we identified as being responsible of the subtitle. So what will happen? What will be the image that will appear? Because now we are modifying the GAN without training it. So it's just, we don't know what effect it will have. So what happened is that these are the 8 images that I was showing at the beginning. So when you deactivate those subtitled units, those 7 units, the captions disappear, the subtitles disappear. Nothing else seems to have changed much. It's not completely true. Like if I flip back and forth, this is before the activating, after the activating. So you can see that there are changes all over the place, but they don't really change the meaning much. It seems like all the elements seem to continue being there. But the subtitle has clearly gone. That's the strongest change in the picture. And watermark is still there. And you can see also, for instance, in this picture, in the second one, that when you make the subtitle disappear, the grass goes on top of it. So by deactivating those units, it's not like the GAN doesn't know what to do now anymore on that region. It's just that other things took over and they just put grass. And then David found 31 more units that were responsible of the watermarks. So now you deactivate them all, then the watermarks disappear. And now you have gotten rid completely of the watermark and subtitles. So just by deactivating these 31 units, you have the same GAN, it produces the same images, but now these images have no watermarks on it. So this is, we have manipulated the distribution, the output distribution of the GAN without having to retrain it, by just identifying what is the set of units responsible of something that we don't want to have on our generated images. And now the question was, well, what else? Are there units that draw towers and trees and doors? What else is inside the network? And there is a beautiful and extended study that David has done on a paper called GAN Dissection and the follow-up papers. So that's the question that we had. What else is here? And, the way that we want to find out what each unit is doing is by looking at the heat maps. So let's say that you want to know what this particular unit here is doing, this unit marked on green. So we know that for a particular random vector is generated, this particular image has been generated. And if we look at the heat map for this particular image on this particular unit, it seems to be this. So this, of course, this drawing is just a sketch of a neural network, but this is an actual real heat map when a GAN is producing this particular image. So you can see that it has two strong activations, and the rest seems to be more or less inactive. The red region means dark red means no activations, and bright white means strong activations. And well, it seems to correspond maybe to these trees, maybe. So you just randomly sample another random vector and let's see what happens. So here is another random vector. This is the image generated. Now we see that the activations of this part of the same unit is mostly inactive. And now we see also that this image seems to have no trees. Another random vector has a different activation. Now we see trees that seem to correspond also with the activation. So this is looking good. This is looking like this unit is generating trees. So another random vector generates a different image. There is no activations, there are no trees. Here, there is only one spot with a strong activation. There seems to be only one tree in this picture. So we do this thousands of times. You generate lots of images and you look at the associated heat map for one particular unit with the corresponding image. And now one thing that you can do is these images are so beautiful. The images that the GAN generates are so realistic that if you run semantic segmentation, any model trained on semantic segmentation on this image is actually able to recognize objects. So in particular here, we have the output of the tree class, and it's able to identify the 3 pixels in this picture. So now what we can do is we can take this heat map, scale it up to the size of this image, so we have the same resolution, and just check if there is agreement between the pixels that are labeled as tree and the regions where this unit is strongly activated. And we do this over many, many images, not just one, but thousands of images. And we measure the agreement. And the way of measuring the agreement, you can do it by measuring, for instance, intersection over union. So you generate from the heat maps, you generate a segmentation, and you just check what is the intersection over union between the segmentation produced by your semantic segmentation and the segmentation produced by the heat map. And then you can do this automatically for not just trees, but all of the object classes that you have in your semantic segmentation output, and all of the units in the dataset in the GAN. So then we can just deploy this automatically and get an automatic detection of all of the units that seem to be responsible of drawing certain objects. So after running that process, what we found is that in layer 4, and I'm going to focus on layer 4, but we'll discuss later what happens in other layers, unit 119 seems to be detecting trees. And this is the top 5 images that were generated when that unit was the most strongly activated. And highlighted here is the region selected by the heat map of that unit. So you can see that it overlaps pretty nicely with trees. This is another layer, another unit, unit neuron number 43 that detects domes. And this is the region where that it was selected by the heat map. So it clearly seems to be correlated with domes. You know, when the GAN is trained to generate living rooms, there is another unit like 84 that seems to be generating windows. Whenever it's activated, a window appears. Another one that seems to be generating chairs, and so on. So now you can do this automatically and get histograms that look like this, where for one particular layer, so this is, I believe, layer 6 or 7, I'll show all of the layers later. In a GAN trained to generate dining rooms, out of 512 units in this particular layer, 252 were highly correlated, had a high IOU when correlated with objects, parts, and materials. And these histograms show the different units that we found, how many units we found for different concepts. So it's not just one unit responsible of windows. There are multiple units responsible of each object class. So in this particular case, we found almost 17 units that were responsible of drawing windows, and around 20, 21 units responsible of drawing the ceiling, and so on. And then there are a lot of units that focus on a piece of an object. Like there are some units that are responsible of only plotting the bottom part of the floor or the top part of a table, and so on. So you can also decompose objects into pieces and check which units are responsible of drawing specific pieces. And this is the histograms that we found when analyzing all of the layers on a big GAN network that has 14 layers trained to generate living rooms. So on the left is the input units that corresponds to the random code. On the right is the output layer that generates the image. So we find that at the beginning, there are no concepts. That makes sense because it's too close to the random code. It's just trying to reorganize the random code. It hasn't really had time to generate any specific concepts. At the end, also, there are very few concepts. And that also makes sense because you are too close to the pixels. So it's already too late to decide where to put chairs. Now, all the receptive fields of these units are really, really small. It's all about refining the edges, refining the colors, and so on. Most of the concepts are found within the intermediate layers, 5, 6, 7. And then so we have this nice shape. If you look at the first layers, it seems to be mostly about layout. The units are responsible of drawing the general layout that the room will have. Then you have objects and parts, and at the end you have edges and textures. So it all makes kind of sense. And the system can output like a general report explaining all the different things that are happening in the layer, and how it reacts with the different units, what they do, what happens for different classes, the number of pixels that seem to be generated with one particular unit, and so on. So it's just a generic thing that you can generate automatically. So you don't need to do this by hand. But if these units are truly doing these objects, if they are truly responsible of drawing these objects, we can also test if there is some causal relationship between the existence of these objects in the picture and the activation or the activation of the units in a particular layer. And Laura, feel free to interrupt me if there are any questions any moment.
No, I'm fine. If anyone wants to ask a question, please go ahead.
Okay. Otherwise, I'll just continue.
Yeah.
So what happens if we intervene on this network and we start manipulating the activations of the units that we hypothesize as being window units? So here's an example of an image that was generated by the GAN. And now we turn off all the window neurons. What happens? Well, the windows are gone and they are replaced by paintings. It's not like we told to the network to do anything specific. It's just that the network was expecting that if there is not a window, okay, we'll continue that with a wall. It could have created a mistake there, no? There could have been, you could see an artifact appearing or something like that, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Instead, it has filled that region with something that is still meaningful, which is quite surprising, because the only thing that we are doing is deactivating the presence of that object. The interesting thing for us is that we seem to have control over which object will appear there. Here is another example for where the GAN is trained to generate meeting rooms. And you turn off the windows, and the windows in the background disappear, and they get replaced by diplomas or something like that. It's like the network knows that in a conference room, you don't have paintings, you have diplomas. This is pretty interesting. It still fills things with walls. There are a few other changes that happen on the image, but most of it is just, is coherent. This is another conference room. There seems to be something that looks like people. No, this is, drawing people by GANs is really hard. But there are some units that seem to be responsible for people, and if you turn them off, then people goes away. There are other changes. This is not a very clean unit, but it's mostly people that are going here. You can also do things like starting getting out of the sample distribution. Like here is an image that is pretty gray. If we want to make it look more colorful, one thing that you can do is turn on grass. But we turn on the grass units all over the place. We are going to activate the entire heat map. We are going to activate the entire heat map. So we will try to put grass everywhere. And when you do that, this is the image that gets generated. And what is interesting is that even though we activated grass everywhere, grass did not appear everywhere. It's kind of strange because it seems that grass appeared in the places where grass could grow if humanity is gone after 1,000 years. You don't expect grass to grow on walls, you expect grass to grow on the horizontal surfaces. And you can think, well, okay, this is just by chance. Why will it do this? Here there are other examples where grass clearly is growing on the roofs. It's not growing everywhere. So this is actually an interesting property about contextual relationships that the GAN has learned. And I will talk a little bit about that later. But this is not actually a fluke. It's actually something that the GAN has learned. The GAN has learned that grass grows on horizontal surfaces because that's what it has seen. And if you activate it everywhere, it will still put it on horizontal surfaces. So, or at least that's our hypothesis. And another thing that you can do is you can actually, select a tree, and if you look at the units that are responsible for drawing buildings, and you randomly activate and deactivate different combinations of those units, you get different styles. So this is just random samples of how we activate and deactivate the units that are responsible for drawing buildings for the same random vector. So the image, we are not changing the generative process in the rest of the units. We are just changing the activations of one set of units, I believe around 20 units in one particular layer. And the building shape doesn't change dramatically, but it's the style of the windows and the domes and so on that seems to change. Another interesting thing that you can do is that sometimes GANs produce images that look like this. It doesn't happen very often, and it depends on how good your GAN is, but sometimes there are artifacts that appear. And the question is this artifact just some distributed process, or again, is just a few units that have gone rogue and are responsible of these artifacts? So, are there artifact causing units? And the answer is yes. We found that unit 63 in layer 4, whenever it got activated, these are the images that got generated. And you can see that the pattern actually looks even pretty similar. There is another unit, 231, that also generates similar artifacts. And we found a few more units. So now you can just deactivate those units and run the GAN as is. So here is an image that had some artifacts. We have deactivated those units, which we found manually. You can try to find them automatically by looking at which units, when they are active, the discriminator that was trained for the adversarial game that you use to train the GAN is more likely to label the image as being unrealistic. If you correlate activations of units with unrealism, we found some of these units, but it was not working as well. So there are some units that really you have to go manually to find them. Or at least we didn't find the method to do them automatically, but we could find a number of them automatically, but manually is what worked best. So once you deactivate them, this is the image that it generates. So it's still not completely artifact free. There is an artifact over there, but certainly looks much better. All the things that were going wrong on the bed are gone. And it was showing that the GAN really knew what to do. there. It's just that there was this unit that was going rogue that was dominating the visualization, but otherwise the GAN already knew to put pillows and you know, and finish the bed over there. And
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are you deactivating units in one layer or across the different network, across different layers?
This is just one layer. This is just one.
I was just thinking, yeah, I was just thinking if you're deactivating one layer and then would the distribution also would change on different layers? So like the objects that were, the neurons that were responsible for particular objects, they will change and then be responsible for something else.
Yeah, as you move across layers, there is of course the units get renamed because there is a random, you know, the ordering of the units within a layer is a random ordering. So, you know, unit 30 is not going to be the same thing in layer I and in layer J. It's just a new random mapping. But generally you find continuity on the concepts. So you can actually do the same changes. And you can do the changes in multiple layers, and sometimes that's actually stronger. No? You get a stronger effect. Yes.
Yeah, I was just thinking that there is some connection maybe because this artifact neurons, they just work in the connection with other neurons that has to be also be deactivated, then they produce something.
Yeah. Yeah, we haven't looked at that much more deeply.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
We got distracted by other problems.
Thank you.
That's a good question.
It's actually a question on YouTube asking, you studied what happened with a GAN trained with dropout and without dropout, or if that has any effect at all on this?
Yeah, so we haven't explored that on GANs, but we have explored that exhaustively on classifiers. And if you have a layer that has dropout, that layer, the units are, you know, they lose meaning. And the reason is because dropout acts a little bit like a randomization, and now you are forced to create a distributed code. So if you have dropout in one layer, you cannot find any more units that have meaning. The layer is doing the same thing, but it's like, you know, you can take the layer and you multiply it by a random matrix that is invertible. The layer is still doing the same thing, but now the units don't have any meaning. And that's basically the effect that you find when you run dropout.
Okay, interesting.
So now, so what I was showing about the artifacts, this happens actually with many of the images that have artifacts. Once you disconnect those artifact units, then images look nicer. There is another really cool thing is that, you know, I've been talking about activating and deactivating units in general. What I meant is that you activate the whole heat map of that unit uniformly across the entire image. But you could do that localized. You could activate that unit only on a specific location. So what if I have this picture and I want to add a window in that location? So I only need to activate the units in that location. If I do that, that's the image that appears. So it just creates a window right there, not everywhere else. There are still some other interesting effects. So for instance, here there is another image. And let's say, you know, this is a GAN generated image. It happened to have no doors. So I really want to have a door in this church. So I'm going to put a door there. So I will activate just the units on that location. And that's what happens. You have a door appearing there. So you really have some control over you know, the fact that these units seem to be rendering the object that, you know, we allocated, you know, the meaning that we allocated to that particular unit. It's not 100% effective. Don't get me wrong. This is not like you activate those units and you're guaranteed to get a door. So sometimes there are locations for which it doesn't work. So here is another example. You activate that location here, you activate the door unit there, and a door appears. But this is, you know, this is not Photoshop. This is not like Photoshop where you go there, you paint a door, and Photoshop better paints a door because you really want to put a door there. GANs are a lot more, have a strong character. And they won't do whatever you want. So let's say that I want to put a door there on the sky. If I activate the door units over there, what happens is this. This is the result. Nothing happens. The cloud seems to change a little bit, but it's certainly not a door. It's still a cloud. So the network has refused to propagate that activation towards the output. And in fact, when we track the activation, we can see the activation, the effect on the output dying out as you go layer by layer. And you can actually analyze that systematically. So here is the effect that it has activating the door units on each location. So the resolution of this map corresponds to the resolution of the heat map of that particular unit on layer 4. And red means that it had no effect. Bright is a strong effect on the output. So you can see that you can actually modify the image when you activate the door units on the building itself, on the walls, but it has very little effects on the towers, on the trees, on the sky. Then it's just the door does not appear. There might be some changes, but they are very small. So here is another question that we just asked recently, and this will be a word that David will present at ECCV just very soon. So if we understand the representation, and that representation is really meaningful, so it really corresponds to what the network is doing, can we reprogram a neural network without retraining it? And I have shown some of the experiments that David was doing with watermarks, and that is like a reprogramming of the network. You are basically shutting down some units manually, and the network now does something different over which you have control. So the question is, can you reprogram the neural network to do even something crazier than that? So here is an interesting phenomenon that we observe when activating different units. For instance, here on the left is an image that was generated by the GAN, where the window units were not active. And then we activated the window units in a particular region where the ConvNets are, here on the left, on the top left of this image. And it generated this other image that is shown on the right, where windows appear. But what is really amazing is that a reflection also appears on the counter. And that's not a region where we were changing anything. The activations were modified on the regions where the windows are appearing. And there is this reflection in the counter, which you can also see a little bit of a reflection there coming from what seems to be like a remaining window here on the image shown on the left, but it's very weak. And the question, so what is really interesting here is that the GAN seems to have a notion of the effect that this object has on the rest of the scene. It's not just here, there is a reflection also appearing on the left side of the counter. So it knows that windows have an effect on the shininess on a shiny counter that is in front of the window. And the question that we had is, well, this looks a lot like not being able to draw doors on the sky. There are some rules here, some contextual rules that seem to be encoded here. And how are these contextual rules being encoded? And can we reprogram these rules? So if we have found some concepts that cluster around few units, can we also find contextual rules that are encoded in the network in a way that we can localize them? And can we change them? So that's the question that we had. And so I want to describe how it works, because you should look at David's presentation at ECCV, which will happen pretty soon, and read his paper. But basically, what we have done is you start with a GAN that is originally trained to generate images that have this property that reflections appear when there are windows. And we want to introduce a change on the network that is going to be very small. In fact, it's going to be done by localizing on the network. So you select on these units, what is the contextual rule on the training images, you select what is the contextual rule that you want to modify, and we locate what is the set of weights that encodes that rule. And we do a one rank order change to that matrix of weights. So we assume that that rule is encoded in a very low rank transformation of that matrix. We modify that weight matrix, just doing a very low rank change to that matrix, and we can change the effect. For instance, we can change the network so that now it's going to do the opposite. Reflections will appear when there are no windows, and whenever there are windows, there will be no reflections. So this is something that is completely different from what the network has seen on the training set. It has never seen this thing, but now that's how it's going to behave. It has changed the rules of how light propagates on the scene. And it's done manually just by a very simple change. So this is just a zoom out of that image. So now, without window, there will be a strong reflection. With windows, the reflections are mostly gone. So
I have one question about that.
Yeah.
So you're not changing anymore one unit, right? Now you're changing several units that like have an exponential effect, right? As you go deeper in the network.
Yeah. So yeah. So when we were objects are codified. Some units, groups of units are responsible of drawing sets of objects. First, okay, this is not true for all of the objects. There are some objects that we haven't found where they are, but there are a number of objects that seems to be very explicitly drawn. These contextual rules are the connections between these objects. So they are encoded on the weights. So instead of the activating units, what we do is modify the weights to modify somehow how one unit is going to get activated in one layer when previous units in the previous layer were activated. So we just want to break that connection.
Okay, I see.
So context, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. No? Objects are individualized. Rules then are the connections in this graph. No? You think of two layers are representing a graph where you have objects in one, objects in both layers that are the nodes, and then the connections are the weights, and they encode how highly is that something will get activated when something else is activated in the previous layer. So we want to modify that.
But this is still from one layer to another, not all the way. Okay.
It's just one layer. We are doing a really tiny change. So the hypothesis that David had is that what these layers are doing is encoding things that look like if-then rules. Things like if you see this, if you see this context like a horse head, then draw ears, horse ears. And that's what the network is doing. So he just wants to change that rule. He wants to change the rule of what you should draw if you see a horse head. And in particular, in these images, when you train these images, you see riders with hats. You never see the horses with hats. So what if now you change the rule so that whenever you see a horse head, you draw a rider's hat? So that's what David is just, you want to copy this particular pattern on the head of a horse. But you don't want to do this as you would do it with copy-paste in Photoshop that will do it on a single image. You want to do this on the generator. You want the generator now to always produce horses with hats. It's not that you want to do this change in this image because you just want to make a fun image. So this change in the rule actually makes this change to propagate throughout the generative process. So now whenever you will sample images, horses will always have hats. And you can see that the hat moves with the horse. It's moving with the pose of the horse. If the horse is bigger or smaller, the scaling variance and so on, these are tricky questions, but the horse, the hat seems to be moving with the horse. So this is this paper will be presented by ICCD. So what I have been showing is that with GAN dissection, which is this technique that was introduced by David to be able to understand what GANs are doing, you can actually change the rules of a generator so that it adds trees, or you can add all kinds of transformations to it. And we have an application that we call GAN Paint that allows you to play with an image that has been generated and start activating at the activating units. And this allows you to see a little bit, what is the effect that these manipulations have on images that have been generated by the GAN, and when it works and when it fails. So there are a bunch of images here that have already been generated by the GAN, and then there are some concepts that we have identified. So this is why we set them by hand, and you can draw objects or remove them, or reset and so on. So it generally works, and most of the time when it fails is because the interface is not the most human-friendly interface. And sometimes I click remove. I forgot that I'm in the remove mode, and I'm trying to add an object and I see that it has no effect, and it's because I'm removing it. I'm not adding it. So just pay attention to it because the icon doesn't change really. Nothing changes when you're adding or removing, which we did this still really quickly. So, but generally it works. So, and there are a lot of interesting demos here. So. It's 10:55. I can give you a few more things, or I don't know if Laura, there are more questions, and we should just devote some time now to just address questions and conclude here the talk, or I could keep talking a little bit.
I mean, I do have a question because so far you have talked about kind of very useful units, right? I mean, you change one unit, bam, and a door appears. But did you find also maybe useless units that you could, remove, and then your GAN would be much more compact? You would save some weights, right? So could you potentially use this to make the model smaller?
That's right. So we haven't explored that, but Song Han, who is a professor at MIT, he has done a lot of work on network compression. And he had a paper, I don't think, it might have been at I2DL this year or last year, where he introduced a way of compressing GANs. And although he doesn't use this idea of, he doesn't explore this, the fact that these units might be or not meaningful, he shows that you can actually remove a lot of units and get the same generative power with a GAN that just runs a lot faster. And we just haven't dissected that to see, what units were removed.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, but it's possible, yeah.
Yeah. There was also a question on the chat if you could potentially apply the same techniques on, for example, a semantic segmentation problem, so that you would avoid, for example, false positives or errors that the network potentially gives out.
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is something we are working on. Yeah, okay, so I don't have an answer because we don't know yet. But yes.
Hey, can I also ask a question? Matthias here. So first of all, really nice talk. I really love the, looking into the networks and seeing which neuron does what. I mean, it seems for visual data, like when you do a generative model, there's actually a lot of correlation with what does each neuron do, and we actually have a plausible explanation about what networks learn actually at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So one thing I'm very curious about, I mean, it seems basically if you push this further, right, you can basically deactivate neurons. You can kind of control the whole generative process by modifying activations in neurons. The alternative direction to that would be, oh, I'm going to always keep the full network, but I'm at training time, I'm going to go ahead and say, I have some sort of disentanglement in the latent space already. I'm saying, okay, this part of the latent space corresponds to window on off, and this part of the latent space corresponds to some style, and so on, right? So what is your intuition between doing this in the latent code versus doing it in the network, possibly after training?
Yeah, I mean, in the latent code, you get, of course, everything is in the latent code because that's the only thing, everything else is a function of the latent code. But some of these local properties are not so well isolated. Like the things that are, when you look at when you navigate through the latent space, you get things like orientation, global styles, and so on. You can get things like the size of the windows. You can change a lot of properties. But having a localized control, it just seems a lot more natural in the middle.
I guess what I'm suggesting is you could still have, if you have a paired setting, right? If I had window on, window off, and have the paired setting in the renderings or so, right? If I have a synthetic case or so, I could probably train it also that the latent codes would correspond to these ones. I mean, there's a couple of papers. I do agree, it has the potential to affect everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think if you train it, you can still get this running.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, you can get it. And I will say that the difference then it will be that. So the interesting thing here is that these units and this isolation of concepts emerges inside the network. It's not, you don't have to train anything. And you can if your goal is just to do image manipulation, then I will say, yes, work with the latent code. If you have a training set that tells you exactly what you want, then probably go there is the best thing, because But then but that's different. This is different in the sense that we just wanted to know what is happening inside. How is the representation being built? And you can impose a representation and say, oh, I care about how tall towers are, and then I'm going to learn in the latent code how to modify the height of the towers.
I see.
Which doesn't necessarily mean that the network at some point had some explicit representation of that. So it's just a different, it's a difference between when you're doing interpretability and you're really trying to interpret why the network is doing something, or you just want to manipulate it in certain ways. But I totally agree. I think that if you have a training set of the fact that you want, you can do it on the latent code.
Interesting.
Probably.
No, I buy it. I mean, you can do it unsupervised. You don't need anything, right? You just get it for free kind of during the training process and you know it. I actually have another question regarding that. So what if you, I mean, let's say I want to retrain. I want to basically go ahead and I want to deactivate these kind of windows and I want to change the windows and I would love to retrain only this specific neuron to get different windows. Do you think there's a path forward to kind of combine this with the whole discriminator?
Okay. Can you repeat the question? Sounds interesting.
So let's say you have a bunch of neurons that corresponds to windows, right? I can turn off windows and I will get something else because that's what the rest of the network will kind of try to compensate for with the activations. What if I wanted to retrain the style of the window? So let's say I identify these neurons are responsible for windows, and I want to retrain specifically only these neurons to get different style of windows or whatever, right? Like what? So this would be really cool because then I could go ahead and say, oh, I want to change specific thing and have more control over the generative process, right?
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting idea. We have explored things like how you can change the style by just playing with activations, but we haven't retrained the network. Like if now you have a training set where you really know that there is a particular style that you want, and retrain just those units. Yeah, I think that sounds very interesting. Yeah, we haven't tried that, and yeah, I mean, I wonder what will happen. Yeah, sounds.
I have another question. Sorry, I'm gonna since we have to use the time. I mean, you talked a lot about GANs. What about the other generative networks? What if you use an autoregressive network? I mean, they were actually like DeepMind last year had a very impressive autoregressive network for generation. I'm not arguing one is better than the other, right? But it seems these things should also be applicable there too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I yes, we have thought about that many times, and I guess that we just got distracted by many other things. But yes, I think that exploring it, running these things on in autoencoders will be great.
Cool. Yeah, thanks a lot. Actually, this was my high level list. I don't know, Laura, do you have any other questions? I mean, I guess I'm gonna give it back to you then.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if there's any other questions on Zoom or on YouTube. So there's also a question which is maybe related to what Matthias said on YouTube, which says that maybe you could try to update, so to train only the highest activating weights for an input picture to see if these weights become even more specialized, or if you could improve even more how those weights generate, for example, windows, right? Which I guess goes into the same direction to what Matthias said.
Yeah, no, I think that those are very cool ideas, and yeah, we haven't explored those. I think that once the network has converged, could you change the regularization so that the units become even more specialized? I think that would be great. And we have been thinking about these things, but we haven't done anything. And it would be great to see something like that happening. My guess is that yes, it's possible.
And I have just like one last maybe like high level question. Do you see better results when your network has very specialized units, or you see better results more in a dropout setting where the knowledge is spread all over the neurons? Because then, well, your method would not work, but maybe the images generated are better. Right?
Yes. So in the case of GANs, we haven't tried with dropout. I don't think this was a regularization term used here. But with classifiers, we have done. So the same equivalent analysis has been done on classifiers, and there is like another talk only about that. So you can, if for those interested, you can look into the network dissection work, and it has all the analysis for classifiers and what happens with dropout. And one interesting thing is that, yes, if you apply dropout in the classifier, it gets better, and interpretability goes down. But it's not that interpretability goes down. It's just that the concepts are mixed. So they don't get you don't find them anymore allocated to single units. They become distributed, but it works better. The same thing happens with batch norm. Actually, if you have batch norm, the network does better, and the concepts drop a little bit. It's it's not perfect. With dropout, another interesting effect is that if you are targeting one layer that you want to interpret, layer I, and you apply dropout to the next layer, then performances go up and interpretability goes up on that layer. But if you apply dropout to the layer that you want to interpret, you destroy it.
Okay, interesting.
Sorry.
Is it actually a thing that people use dropout a lot for GANs? I mean, not that much, right?
I don't think so, yeah.
I mean, but it seems what's happening is, and I mean, following your insights is that we do overfit in GANs, generally speaking, locally speaking, to some sort of pattern, right? And then we turn it off, and then the network kind of learns how to blend them in some way over the layers, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it seems like it. I mean, we don't know for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, we have analyzed a number of other networks. It's just that with GANs, everything is just slow to do. But we also had a paper recently on conditional GANs and showing that you can do the same thing, but now as a function of conditioning, and you can see the meaning of the units changing as you condition on different classes, and you can see that some classes seem to be reduced across categories. It's interesting to look at that case.
So what's the future of conditional GANs then? I mean, if you're following this through, right, you could basically just take an existing trained network and then just condition which neurons you turn on and turn off, assuming you have a large enough manifold. In principle, this could basically replace like existing manifolds, right? You could, like if you think about what StyleGAN is doing, right? You have an existing manifold, you're trying to traverse it, and you're trying to find whatever like explains your input in the best possible way. But what you could do is you can take the whole network, right, and say, oh, which neurons do I actually need to get the best quality as well?
Yeah.
But isn't it what all is StyleGAN doing?
Yeah.
Sorry, what?
Isn't it what all is StyleGAN doing? Like StyleGAN kind of network where they already changed this incoming activations. They apply no instant normalization. After that, they do change their mean and variance, right? So basically, they're already tuning the activations at output on different layers.
Not turning off and turning on neurons, right? They're doing it only in the latent space.
No, after that, like after you did instant normalization, you do you change the mean and variance, right? And this one can basically make it smaller or bigger.
But you're only doing it at the input level, right? You're not doing it somewhere randomly in the network or so.
No, you do it in the network. In the StyleGAN, you do through all the decoder part. So you choose you choose the latent code that is going to be going to go through all the decoder part, but in decoder you change these basic activations, right?
Oh, so the argument is because because the activations change, the mean and so on shifts to.
Yeah, so it's in a similar way that it's already kind of tuning out the signal that's coming out from the network.
Yeah, but I think it's not quite that, right? I don't think it's going to go ahead and say, oh, I mean, it's just normalizing the activations. I think it's not choosing like which neuron is the most important one.
Well, after that, like after it normalized it, it chooses whether it's which signal to propagate later on, right?
Yeah, but it's not retraining it. I mean, it's just keeping the neurons the same. There's no hard switch on and off, right?
There's no hard switch. There's no hard switch. Yeah, it's learnable stuff. But yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking that it's kind of similar as well, concept wise.
Well, I still think the interesting concept is whether like, do you retrain this whole thing and do you try to re-optimize? Or you try to select out of an existing pattern, like what you already trained, and then recombine it. I think
yes, this is different. Yes, that's true.
But I mean, I agree, but I don't think we know it as a community. I think this is still very interesting. I find this one super interesting. I haven't seen it in fairness, so I'm very impressed actually that you can still get reasonable images when you turn off a neuron. Like I would have expected it's going to completely fall apart and generate some random patterns.
Yeah, no. You can actually, if you play with GAN paint and you just start removing units, you're deactivating a lot of units, and you will see, it takes a while for the image to look crazy. You can get it.
Impressive, actually. I mean, I wouldn't have expected it. I would have said, well, why do we try that? I mean, typically it doesn't work anymore when we don't retrain.
Yeah.
But yeah, very, very cool.
Very nice. So yeah, I think we're running out of time. Thank you, Antonio, for the super nice presentation. It was really, really insightful, really cool stuff that you're doing there. And yeah, basically, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.